So the file that I have open right now is sent to me by a student who is trying to build a forecast, and they've asked some questions on it. So I'm going to go through it and just try to see what makes sense and what doesn't. The first thing is we go down the profit and loss statement, we can see that revenue is growing slightly. EBITDA is growing slightly. That probably makes sense. By the time we get down to EBIT, it's it's slower growth, right? And that's probably to do with the depreciation here, which is probably tending to be a bit high. Interest expense is pretty flat, and we can see that taxes are also pretty flat, and therefore net profit comes out flat for the next 5 or 6 years, which may not really make sense. So we'll go back and look at that in a second. If we go down and look at the balance sheet, what we can see is that the amount of cash being held has gone down quite dramatically according to the forecast. We can see that the amount of gross fixed assets probably reasonable. Nothing stands out. It's good to look at the numbers first. Oh, there we see something that looks a little odd. Overdrafts and short-term loans come in as a negative. That can't be. And so we can also see here another interesting one is that accounts payable looks a little bit high compared to where it's been in the past. So that looks like something that we could fix. Also, other current liabilities looks a little bit high compared to the past. So these are two sources of funds that are free funds for us. If we over predict them and predict them to be very high, we're going to be estimating that we get free money, and therefore we don't need to borrow any money there. And long-term borrowings we kept flat. And then let's see, retained earnings is falling quite dramatically over time. You can see from about 46 right here in the period of 2009 going down to 35. Very rare that that retained earnings falls like that. So now that we've got an idea of that, why don't we go through and see what we can do to try to adjust that a bit. Well, let's look at our revenue growth. That's probably okay. We can accept that, 3%. Gross profit margin, right now, we don't have any reason to think that it would be otherwise up or down, so we're going to keep it flat. Right now, the CapEx, I'm going to keep where it is. Why is that? Well, that's because when I look at the amount of spending on gross fixed assets, it's a little bit every year, and our net fixed assets basically increase a little bit every year. Now we could reduce it just a little bit if we wanted to. Let's say that it's changed this to be 7,000 or 7 billion in this case bought, and then we have less growth in our fixed assets there. That's possible, but also we know that some companies have CapEx pretty lumpy, so what ends up happening is you think it's going to be 7 and 7, and then all of a sudden it's 25 billion in that year because they have to do a major project. But right now we don't know enough to put that in, so let's keep it at 7. The depreciation charge that we've got right now, let's leave it there for right now, but that's going to come up and show right here where we may decide to change that depreciation down. Now you'll notice that when I clicked on that, it went, and I'm going to undo what I just did. Look at this cell M8. It's a negative. But when I clicked and, let's say, move that to 10, watch M8. It turned to be positive. Now that's a little bit strange. I'm not exactly sure why that happened. But what I would say is that all we have to do is look down at M79, which is where it's coming from. M79 is a positive number here, but it really should be a negative number. So I'm going to put down a negative there and make sure that we get the calculation correct in that. So now that's okay, and that's okay. Now the other thing you're going to see is that what's been happening here is that we've left the amount of other flat. I'm going to change that to 0 just because I don't want that to be misleading me. I'd rather make my adjustments through the CapEx. So now that I can see what that amount of depreciation is, now I'm going to come back and take a look at my fixed assets, and here this should be also okay, positive what we've got. So we've got a reasonable number here. There we go. And so we can look at our net fixed assets, which is ultimately what's important, and we can see net fixed assets are falling quite dramatically. So most businesses wouldn't allow that to happen. So what that probably means is that we've got to increase the CapEx amount. Why don't we increase it to 15 billion, and then that'll keep our net assets about flat. Now we could increase it a little bit here, let's say to 20 billion, and then that would keep our net assets kind of coming up a bit, as we can see there. So that may get us back to a reasonable number. Let's see where that takes us in the P&L. Okay, now that gives us a very high depreciation, or very low compared to the past. That could be unrealistic. Now, part of that's mainly because we can see our depreciation number here is quite low compared to the prior period. Let's change that to 15. Whoops, sorry, 15. And what we'll see is that depreciation kind of comes back up to maybe a reasonable level. We can leave our other income kind of as a small amount of growth. If we look at our interest expense, now what you'll see is that as we go down here, we'll see that line 90, overdrafts and short-term loans, has nothing in it. Well, we have to pull that down from our balance sheet, and here it is, our overdrafts. If I pull that down, I'm going to see that. Now we got to make sure that we have our options calculation on automatic and iterations, or else we'd get circular references. So I'm going to copy that over and see where we're ending up now. Now what you can see is that our amount of